Gemma, I want to start by thanking you for making the time.
Thank you so much for having me. This is going to be fun.
I know I'm so excited to talk to you for so many reasons. And the theme of our conversation is going to be around how, if you have a lot of interest, if you're a curious person, how do you actually channel that curiosity in a productive way with your writing? So that's going to be our theme, but there's a hell of a lot to unpack. And I think there's nobody better than Gemma to talk to about it. But before we get into it, Gemma, I wanted to ask you, you've had this amazing career doing everything from, I think, being a sous chef, a science teacher, door-to-door saleswoman, an investment banker, and working in advertising at Ogilvy. I'm curious to hear how you actually got into writing full-time.
I was made redundant or laid off, as you say, in the US in 2016. So I worked in corporate innovation at Ogilvy, as you mentioned. And Ogilvy did a very innovative thing, and they shut the innovation team. And me, along with my colleagues, were very surprisingly just made redundant. We only had sort of 3 weeks left of gardening leave, and then that was it. And I didn't have any savings. I was like, how does this work? I don't know. And I thought, okay, I'll just do some freelancing, because I'd already had a little bit of experience doing a lot of public speaking and writing a few bits and bobs for industry press, because in my job in corporate innovation, I guess I had that sort of acting as a thought leader on behalf of the company. So I did a lot of speaking and little bits of commentary. I knew that there was ways of doing that and monetizing it and whatnot. So I just messaged a lot of people and said, hey, Ogilvy's made us redundant. Do you have anything that I can help with, whether it's consulting or writing or whatever? But I found quite a few people were asking me to write, and I did it a few times and thought, okay, this is, first of all, really hard, but I do like it. And I like the idea of making a living by essentially having ideas and finding a way to put them out in the world. And just over time, freelancing, doing various different things, the thing that I found I was getting the most out of, at least in terms of feeling like I'm really doing what I'm meant to be doing and the thing that I'm strongest at, was specifically to do with writing or podcasting, basically putting my ideas out into the world, particularly in ways that were for myself as opposed to for a company. Yeah, it was just 4 years of freelancing and keeping pitching and Googling, how do you become a freelancer? Following any advice I could find online, to be honest. I've never had any training or anything, not formally. So Google's a magical thing when it comes to writing, I find.
Yeah, and something I love that you've done is you've managed to just pick ideas that I think really resonate, and that a lot of your work has been published in just about every major outlet. So I'm really curious, as you've gone on this journey of starting to share your ideas more, starting to really build a career around somebody known for their ideas, make a living doing that. How have you thought about picking what's worth writing about, starting to really hone in on where you want to develop some expertise?
Yeah, definitely. This has been something I've thought a lot about, especially because when I was at Ogilvy, I was known as being in advertising. I was Gemma from Ogilvy. And as much as my role at Ogilvy was concerned around innovation and technology and startups and whatnot, I was still very much associated with the advertising industry. And even also alongside that, I was hosting a podcast about science. So I had, I guess, a community or a little audience, a very small audience at that time, who knew me as the science and tech person, but it was really small. And so when I started freelancing, I knew that in order to make money, I had to lean into the fact that I was known as a bit of a knowledgeable person or an expert within sort of innovation and advertising. So I should try and get work in writing in that space. But at the same time, I knew there was a cost to doing that, because I didn't want to further cement that idea. I wanted to be known as Gemma, the science and tech person. And of course, a lot of this work comes to you as opposed to you pitching eventually. So you really want to be known for a particular kind of thing. So it was a constant sort of balance of really putting myself out there and really trying to establish my writing in that space, whether it was really pushing the podcast or pitching really hard to get to write about those topics, or even when I was writing about innovation and advertising, it would be like, let's talk about science and tech in this article, so that I'm at least thought of in that way and getting to write about stuff I actually care about, but getting paid to do it and doing it in a space that kind of makes sense from the expertise space. And I suppose that's also part of how I've managed to do what I've managed to do, because tend to be coming at it a lot of time first and foremost as an expert as opposed to a writer. So I'm not commissioned as a journalist, but rather you are someone who understands this, and therefore, and you happen to be able to write and you've written before. So I lean on that as well, which tends to help. And over the last few years, I've built up proper expertise in science and tech, working with like the government and a few other, you know, big companies and whatnot, to show that actually I do have industry expertise, not just writing expertise. I suppose it sounds really clinical, but I've always been like, you have to think about your brand when you're a freelancer. Yeah, there's a reality to that, and you have to be quite deliberate about what is public about what you do and what you maybe don't tweet about quite so much, because it is confusing to people who don't understand the freelance lifestyle as much as you go, yeah, I happen to be interested in many different things, but not everybody gets that. And at the end of the day, you do have to establish that expertise. Yeah, it was quite deliberate. And I think the book has massively helped, because sometimes people think of science and tech writers as people that write about discovery. So sometimes I'll get pitches being like, oh, we've just published this paper about this thing. And I'm like, I actually don't cover discovery. I tend to cover the business of science, or politics around science, or intersection of science and society. And that wasn't entirely clear until my book came out, and folk were like, okay, I get you. I understand your angle a bit more. And now it's much easier to, I guess, to establish myself. And I'm a researcher as well. I'm doing a PhD. So that also makes it so much easier in terms of introducing yourself and being like, this is what I actually want to write about. But I don't know, I've always really tried to also, as much as I've been very deliberate about being, I'm in science and tech, I do make sure that I cover other things too, so that I then also don't get put in that box. And I don't know, I'm very big on the fact that I'm interdisciplinary, and I'm quite proud of it. And I try my best to put that at the forefront so that folk don't end up thinking that I'm either in a box or I'm some kind of guru for a particular idea, which is really not what I'm all about.
I know, and I love the idea you mentioned, as time goes on, you do start to develop real expertise, and you can lean on that as you build your brand. But I've always been captivated by this idea of, if you write about something, you can write your own credibility. You can will it into existence, if you will. But I'm curious,
to a degree.
Right.
I think, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. And I think it depends on what kind of expertise we're talking about here. So so I'll give you the example of the podcast that I host, right? So I've been co-hosting this podcast since 2016, originally called Science Disrupt. It's now called Radical Science. And they're interview podcasts. So every episode, almost every episode, is an interview with somebody who is an expert, or who at least represents an idea or whatever that we want to talk about. And in some sense, you could say, what's this made me an expert of? Maybe an expert in interviewing. I can legitimately say that I'm an expert interviewer. I'm an expert podcaster. But you can also say, how do you get a degree? You get a degree by listening to experts, reflecting on their ideas. Yeah, okay, maybe you write something here and there, you do an exam and you're tested for particular ideas. But a lot of the time it's about, have you engaged with the ideas and do you understand them? And I think interviewing people weekly or bi-weekly for 4 years around certain kinds of topics does tend to make you pretty knowledgeable about those topics. And so that is a good example of how I've become an expert as such, or at least knowledgeable in academic culture, because that's a lot of the themes, particularly in the podcast. We also talk on like open science society. And so we've been hearing from these leaders of the industry and getting one-to-one discussions with them that we just put on the internet, but you get the expertise. On the other hand, I would never claim to be an expert in investing until I had some experience working as a VC scout, or working with the European Commission looking at grant applications and allocating money. I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable writing from the perspective of that person without having done it. I could talk about it, but I wouldn't necessarily say. So I think there's certain things that I think you have to understand the culture around, or you at least have to make an effort to understand the culture around, or interview people that understand the culture around, as opposed to just writing it into existence. I think the intention of writing often enough means that you're going to obviously engage and then become expert, perhaps because you're part of that community. But I don't think just writing about it is enough. Maybe I'm being too conservative though.
Oh no, thank God. I think we need more people. I think if there's any part of the spectrum society is too far skewed on, it's a lot of thought leaders on things maybe they haven't done. And so I love that mindset. And I totally agree that playing with the ideas and interacting with them is this critical piece in actually developing meaningful knowledge. I'm really curious, given the different ideas that you've covered, given kind of the breadth and the depth of stuff that you write about, how have you gone about choosing where you're going to spend your time writing? You mentioned some of your strategy of how you want to build your brand and your perception, but I'm curious, science and tech is a big world. How do you choose where to really invest your time writing, and what's worth writing about?
I really like to write about things that I think are misunderstood. And the reason that I know they're misunderstood, or at least that some portion of people misunderstand it, is because at one point I misunderstood it. And I had a penny drop moment of, that's how that works. Or, oh, I did not realize that was a factor in that at all. Or, interesting. And so I want to replicate that feeling for people. That's like my favorite thing to do, is you build up this story, you tell people this thing, and, oh, you thought it was this, but actually it's this. And isn't it crazy that actually this thing over here is the thing that impacts it? I think that's really a brilliant way it's a fun way of storytelling, but it's also true to the way the world works a lot of the time, particularly when we think about the sort of areas of science tech I cover is what's predominantly called deep tech. So it's things that are just emerging out of science labs most of the time, and they're very intellectual property heavy. So things like fusion energy or quantum computing or cancer therapies and whatnot. I'm not as interested in sort of digital technologies. And what's really critical about deep tech is that it normally impacts a very complex system. If it's fusion energy, you're talking about in world energy systems. If you're talking about cancer therapeutics, you're talking about world health systems. And you can't create a slide deck as a startup in this field and be like, here's this problem, we've made this solution, and now it's fixed, because it doesn't work like that. Like, there's so much to it that you have to construct. And so the sort of surprising, weird stuff that makes these industries, innovations, areas of science and tech tick tend to be quite surprising. So for instance, batteries, you can't really fully grasp the interesting area of the batteries industry unless you understand like Chinese geopolitics and like Chinese trade and like strategy around how smart communism is built, because that is really at the core of like supply chain and batteries. We can't only talk about Tesla, right? It's such a small part of the picture. So I try to find things within science, tech, culture, society, policy, whatever it is. It's quite surprising, and try and find ways of telling those stories and sharing that sense of awe. But also, I don't know, like I think if when you have that knowledge, it makes you really understand the system at its core, as opposed to just having this like extra bit of knowledge about a piece of tech. And I think that's more important as someone who writes about science and tech than simply saying this is how it works.
God, I love that. And I think you got my mind spinning here, because I think it's funny. It can... something we were chatting about a little bit earlier before we started was the idea that sometimes you think you're onto something, but you have this self-talk that's surely this has been written about, right? Surely I can't be the person who's peeled back the universe and found this interesting truth, if you will, or observation. So how do you find maybe the confidence or how do you not talk yourself out of writing about some of these ideas?
To be honest, it's because I'll have a deadline and I'm normally like weeping by this point. It'd be like, oh, I have to submit in 3 hours. Like I really struggle, to be honest, to find because it's not ever finished. And this, when you're looking at a topic deeply, there's always more to be found. There's always someone that's written a piece that disagrees with your central point. You're like, damn it, I need to change it all. And yeah, I absolutely suffer from that feeling of, oh, this has already been written about. So what am I adding here? People could just go read that piece that was written a couple of years ago. And obviously, if I was speaking to a friend that was saying this to me, I would be saying, yeah, but the fact that you only discovered this recently means that other people have still not discovered it, and there's still a role to be played for talking about these ideas, and you're going to place them in different contexts, and you're going to make these connections that no one else will, or you'll just reframe, and that's still extremely powerful and useful and interesting. I think, though, I also suffer from a feeling of, and we were saying this before we came on as well, around I really want people who already understand this stuff to think that what I'm writing is good. Like, I'm constantly like striving to have people that I hold up on a pedestal to hold me up on a pedestal. And that's really difficult to achieve when you're writing about something that they already know, because if they're generous, they might be like, oh, that's articulated. And if not, they'll be like, yeah, duh. It's like you're in this constant like battle of trying to impress this like sometimes imaginary person and forgetting that the whole thing you're trying to do is bring everybody else along on this journey. There's a particular piece at the moment that I'm really passionate about. It's all about unions in science. And I've been thinking about unions in science for months for this blooming 800-word piece. It's like very poorly paid. And because I care about it, I read a lot about it, and I think I've got my central idea, and then I read a piece and I'm like, that kind of doesn't really work for that, or that person's going to disagree, and now you just end up with way too much. So it's normally a deadline. In this case, his editor's lovely, and he's just like, yeah, just whenever, which of course means I'll never write it unless he gives me a firm deadline, or I have so much time in my hands that there's nothing else to do but write.
Totally. It's funny. I just to reiterate, the highest piece of engagement I've ever gotten in my personal newsletter was when I revealed I had just learned a pickle and a cucumber were the same thing. And it's I didn't know that 2 years ago. And that got, pretty much everyone knows that, but I actually got this huge reaction of people like, wait, what? Yeah. So I love your idea that if you just discovered something, very likely there's other folks like you.
It's not just even that, it's also, do you find it interesting too? And I think you can bring yourself down a peg a little bit to make this easier to think about. The way that I justify, if I say, oh, is this really interesting? Is my idea so interesting? You're elevating yourself a little bit. You're going, oh, I've thought of this idea that's so superior, people couldn't possibly understand why it's interesting. But actually what you're saying is, you're going to have to think through and go, I am not so special that I'm the only person on this planet that finds this interesting. There's obviously other people that find this interesting because there's however many billion people on this planet. So you have to bring yourself down a peg a little bit and be like, okay, fine, like just write it. It's fine. And there's a difference maybe in terms of, are you writing it in an interesting way versus is the idea interesting in and of itself? Those are different things. But I think I tend not to worry too much about the idea at the center of it being interesting. I guess I get worried a little bit with whether it's right or timely or already been said or particularly fun or all these other things that are just barriers to realistically just getting down.
100%. I love that framing. It's funny because it doesn't seem like it comes from a place of somewhat arrogance, but in a way it does, because you're putting yourself like, right. Is there anyone else like me out there? No, I'm a snowflake.
It's also just, I think sometimes the way we talk about writing, and this is, I think journalism can be quite guilty of this as an industry, specifically science journalism or technical writing people, is folk won't be interested in this. This is too intellectual. This is too difficult. This science is not, this piece about, I don't know, nanomaterials is not directly relevant to the average reader's average day. So therefore they won't be interested. This doesn't impact their commute or their immediate health. So why would they be interested? And it's, how patronizing is that? People have the ability to be interested in things that don't immediately impact what's right in front of them. And I think science journalism specifically can be so guilty of being like, we really need to dumb this down so the folk understand. And it's this very kind of, why do you get to decide what to lecture other people on and what's important? We must get these ideas out. It's this kind of, it's very educational as opposed to entertainment. And I think this is one of the biggest problems within science writing as a whole, is this sort of assumption that people are not interested or not intelligent enough or not on the ball enough or whatever. And that can feed back into your own feelings of, is this interesting? Am I making this clear enough? And it's, all you can know is if you put it out there and see if people like it.
I know. And it actually leads perfectly into something I was curious about, which is when you do go about, talking about batteries, understanding what's going on in China from almost a geopolitical level, part of you probably obviously has to keep an audience in mind, and maybe how do I wrangle in the complexity here in a way that is compelling for folks? I'm really curious to hear, maybe this is a two-part question. One, how you go about laying out the facts and maybe like picking the facts and the things that are worth sharing with a broader audience. Generally, how you do research, how you think about your kind of core thesis in a piece. And the second part, I'm really curious to ask how you think about communicating it to people who haven't, while it may be accessible for them, haven't been thinking about it as much as you have. But curious to hear how, your research process first.
Sure. My research process is it's just reading as many different angles of attack on a thing as I can get my hands on. And also not just reading things, but like sitting in conferences and webinars, watching videos, listening to podcasts, like trying to just get as many different kinds of takes and angles. And I try not replicate so much. So if I've heard a lawyer talk about batteries, then I'll maybe look for a politician, and then maybe I'll look for someone from a different country. Or it's not always so intentional. It's not like I've got a checklist, but it's if I've already heard a lawyer talk about it, I probably don't need to hear another one, unless my piece is specifically about law and I need to go really deep on law. So it's trying to get these different angles of attack or different perspectives, visions, whatever you want to put in it. But I also think a lot about this idea of the theoretical minimum, which is a book which is somewhere on here, because I'm going to forget the guy's name. I always forget. I bring this up in every interview and I forget his name every single time. Where is the damn book?
We'll dig up the...
Here we go. It is Leonard Susskind, or Susskind, I don't know how you say his surname. Anyway, he wrote a series of books. He collaborated on some of them. Anyway, all around this idea of the theoretical minimum. So he's a physicist, and he basically got the opportunity to teach physics in a sort of public program at the university that he was at. I think it was somewhere in California. That's really bad. I've forgotten all that stuff. Anyway, and he wanted to teach it not as a sort of intro to physics, like documentary that you would see, but rather give people the tools to do physics, who are not people who are physicists, who are people just interested to go to a university lecture in their evening, but give them the information that allows you to actually engage and do physics, whether that's following the news, whether that's doing little calculations on the back of an envelope, whatever that means. And so I'm really fascinated by this idea of what is the knowledge that you have to give someone in order for them to participate, not just to understand, but to participate. And because that's basically what, and his book is not about this concept. His book is what is the theoretical minimum of physics. So he's teaching you physics. But I think that the concept is really interesting. And for me, it's like when you think about science and tech, again, I don't think it's all that useful to explain the inner workings, and everything is, you can zoom in and zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. If you started talking about a battery, you could end up talking about quantum physics at one point. And it's if you really zoom in, so you really need that in order to understand whether or not you should buy a Tesla, or even just what's interesting about China. So for me, it's trying to find like the nodes of the web, and you just give people the nodes and then they can fill in the web themselves. That's how I think about it. I tend to be like, okay, what are the nodes of society, right? Or what are the kind of structures that we have in society? We have like finance, we have law, we have social, cultural norms, we have like actual sort of organizations like universities, media, government, corporates. We have like different political systems or political ideas and ideologies. So there's not actually that many. That's only like, maybe there's 15. And if you basically type in law and batteries, and then like cultural norms and batteries and whatever, and you marry all these different things, you start to make this like really interesting picture, true picture, fuller picture of a system. And that's what I try to do specifically in the book. That's what I try to do in each chapter, is show this map and give people this map and explain it to a degree that allows you to understand it, specifically so that people could then watch the news or see an announcement on Twitter or whatever it is and go, that's linked to this or whatever. So that's how I think about it in terms of how you take a complex topic and research and ultimately work out the structure. Let me know if you want me to add anything to that before I move on to the comms bit.
No, that's fantastic. I think it's a perfect segue, because I love this idea of you're trying to give your readers resources to really interact with the ideas themselves, which I just love. Yeah, I am curious to hear more about how you craft a narrative or put together a piece that's actually approachable.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's the best feedback I've been getting from the book, is when people say, oh, I read this chapter and then like me and my partner sat talking about it for an hour because we disagreed on this bit. And I was like, awesome. You're not meant to take my book at face value. You're meant to take the bits. And I think half the book is questions. There's so many question marks in this book for the reason, because there's no answer. But anyway, comms, yes. I actually really hate explaining things. I find it really tedious. So I tend to leave it to last. That you can see the earlier drafts of my book where it's like, insert explanation of fusion here, and then it like carries on to all the other stuff. Just because I find it, I don't know. I think I'm always like trying to get to the end of it as quickly as possible, which maybe is lending itself to better communication, because I'm trying to work out what's the minimum that this person needs to know, i.e. how do I do this in as few words as possible. I use some examples, but I don't lean on them way too heavy. I try to find the sort of theoretical framework, again, so that it's just enough to really understand something. without skimping on the detail. And I think a lot of it is also trying to find what is the point that people tend to not understand, or what's like the crucial thing that's important to get. So for instance, with fusion, you could talk a whole load about the fusion of nuclei, and you could talk about like what a nuclei is, what the different parts of the nucleus is, why it's actually, why hydrogen is specifically used, like all different things specifically about that. You could then talk about, I don't know, why it has to be a particular temperature or all this sort of thing. For me, the crucial point about fusion, if you're talking about it from like a creating fusion energy perspective, is you have to replicate the sun on Earth. That's the point. And when you think about the sun and how massive it is and how hot it is, very quickly you immediately understand why fusion is really hard. And so then you can start to go, okay, what is it you have to do in order to replicate the conditions of the sun, or in order to engineer this? And suddenly you start thinking about things like high temperatures and high pressures, and how do you create a really complex machine, and how do you hold things so that they don't hit the walls, because obviously the wall is going to have issues if you're going to have huge temperatures or huge pressures. So you find this like core question, or this core problem that hasn't been solved. And this is another thing as well, by the way, about bringing people in. It's not about explaining it as if it's in the past. It's going, what is it that the scientists haven't worked out yet, and work back from there? Because ultimately that's what people want to know. They don't want to know the history. Well, maybe they do want to know the history. That's part of the narrative. But in terms of explaining fusion, they don't want an entire physics class. They want to go, why can't we do it? Okay, it's because we have to re-engineer the sun, and that's really hard. Why is it hard? Because high temperature, high density, high pressure. So I kind of work back from the problem or the question. And I also try and find the kind of interesting, I guess, the stories, the narratives, the interesting characters that have come up through the history of trying to answer this question, trying to solve that specific problem. And of course, that it blows out from there. So yeah, I suppose it's always starting with the, what is it that is the whole, I hate the term Holy Grail. I literally wrote that in the batteries chapter that we shouldn't use these terms. But what is the Holy Grail? What is the thing that scientists are really focused on? What's the thing that, what are they arguing about at conferences? What is going to be the main keynote at a fusion scientist conference? That's what people actually want to know. They don't want to just know how fusion works, because they're still spectators and amateurs. What you really want to be able to do is engage and be able to not understand every word of the latest paper that's written about fusion. I don't understand that, but I want to be able to read an article about scientists that just actually managed to do, I don't know, some form of magnetic thing, and you're like, that's related to the fact that they use the magnets for this. Oh, that might be solving that problem, I wonder. And sure enough, you start reading the article and you're like, yeah, they are trying to solve that. There's the problem. And so it's much more engaging than just going, I know about nuclei, so therefore, and then you're just lost in the press.
I love it too, because it almost keeps your eye open for how the story is going to keep unfolding. I almost feel like you're part of this.
That's what I mean. That's exactly what I mean about this, and you're letting people be part of it. Because I'm sure some people read science and tech, popular science, popular tech, whatever, and study it because they're, obviously people who study it are inherently interested. And I'm sure some people read articles and stuff just because they want to know how it works. But I'd be willing to bet that a lot of people want to actually know where we're currently at, or what scientists are currently doing, or why it's hard, or why it's not being done yet. It's not just how it works. And explanation-based science tech media that's really focused on this explanation stuff realistically is more like a lecture. How does a volcano work? That's interesting as a lecture, but it doesn't really tell us about the state of, I don't know, geoengineering using volcanoes, does it? It only tells us how a volcano works, which is inherently limited, really.
100%. God, you've got my mind just utterly blown. I'm rethinking how I've ever written any blog post.
Who am I to say? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Don't listen too hard. Critically think, kids. You know?
Right. Don't just drink the Kool-Aid. Well, in our last maybe like 10 minutes or so of the kind of interview portion here.
Oh my goodness.
But
it's fine. No, I was like, is it an hour already? But no, that's fine.
Then we'll do the Q&A, and some folks submitted questions beforehand. But I want to do a bit of a 180 or actually dive into your book, and specifically the idea of hype. So maybe just for folks who haven't read it or aren't familiar with it, would you mind maybe just sharing the quick summary of your recent book? And I've got a few questions on how it maps on to writing and to content.
Sure. Yeah, so the book is all about hype in science and tech, and it was born from a frustration of sitting in conferences and hearing big claims and reading articles that didn't feel quite true and receiving press releases that I knew were over exaggerated, but at the same time being very aware of the industry that is tech and science and startups and whatnot, and the kind of inherent need for hype and attention in order to be heard, whether that's through funding or getting grants or changing laws or whatever. So I saw it as a sort of weird sort of invisible hand, and I wanted to look at the force that was hype. And I started off thinking hype is obvious to explain, just get a dictionary definition, but it turns out it's actually everybody has different ideas about what hype is, and a lot of people associate it with like fake news, disinformation, misinformation, but I'm actually more interested not in deliberate lying, which disinformation, misinformation, fake news is, but rather lost context messages that can result in misinformation, which is really what hype is. So I think about it with respect to magician, which is why I called the book Smoke and Mirrors. If you go to a magic show, you are consenting to be fooled. You're walking in going, hello, please fool me. I might try and work it out. I might just enjoy the show, but either way, it's fine for you to try. If you're being lied to, it's non-consensual fooling. I think hype is a tool that is used for attention, not for understanding, but attention, that sometimes when it's taken out of context can result in accidental fooling. And I wanted to look at the sort of impact across 9 different areas of science and tech, which I use as a sort of examples in the book, everything from cancer to quantum computing to farming to space. And yeah, kind of just show people how these systems actually work so that you can then understand the context so that the messages are not lost in translation. But also to just, the final point here, really hammer home the point that hype exists and it's being used as a tool. And we can talk about the morality of it, that's a sort of separate thing, but the reality is it is there. And hype's power is in the fact that you don't know it's there. So when you know it's there, you're immediately able to look a little bit deeper and not be accidentally fooled. And that's the big point for me, is about empowering people to feel able to engage so that they're not swept up in hype, regardless of how much background they have in science and tech.
And I know I love how hype maps onto all these different other categories of life. I love what you said earlier. Hype is a tool for attention, not understanding. I think that's brilliantly put. It's funny, I couldn't help but see so many parallels between hype in the science and tech world and even like the kind of startup and business world, and also in the content space, right? Every year there's some new book that, is going to change everyone's life, and there's a lot of drum beating. And of course, 2 years later, it's the next book and lives remain unchanged to some extent. So I'm really curious how maybe you think about, as writers and as people maybe who are bloggers, or maybe they're trying to do traditional publishing, how do you think of tasteful, using hype as a tool to tastefully garner some attention and get your work seen while maybe not crossing this line? Just curious how you think of hype in the context of being a writer.
Sure. Yeah, I speak a lot about startups, and people in those spaces tend to ask me to be like, what is responsible hyping? And so I speak a lot about that, specifically in terms of like startup pitch decks. But I suppose in terms of writing, I hadn't thought about what does it mean to responsibly hype. From my own perspective, I had to think about this a lot, both in terms of the content of the book, but also in terms of marketing the book. Because if you overhype a book about hype, people are not going to really take you very seriously, are they? And it came out in April in the middle of a pandemic, and I had a lot of media requests being like, can you talk about hype in coronavirus? And I was very conflicted about whether to do that or not, because I am a science writer. I can understand these areas well because of my skills in being in this world. But at the same time, I'm not an epidemiologist. I've not written about viruses before. I have the ability to go and research, but that isn't where my expertise lies. And I don't think that because you've written a book about hype in science and tech, you can immediately talk about hype and a global pandemic as it's playing out. But at the same time, I knew that if I spoke about it, my book would be front and center as it was launching, and it would be very good for sales. In the end, I chose not to. But I think there's a lot of tension here around, we all know that the reality is that if you want your work to be seen, you do have to employ certain kinds of marketing tools. This whole idea of build it and they will come, it is not true. It's not. Sometimes it is for like rogue pieces that go viral or are picked up, but it's so rare that you have to engineer hype of sorts in order to get your ideas heard. And unless you're writing for your own benefit in your diary, If you're putting it on the internet, you want people to see it, surely. So I do understand that, but at the same time, there is an environment of sorts that snack content, as opposed to the full meal, tends to get a lot more attention. It's easier to market. And I think sometimes the sort of lack of shame of some particular kinds of writers blankets across everybody else. So I think that tension's there. I don't have the answer to it, but I do think that there is a hunger out there for more in-depth, thoughtful content, which has always been there. This is not new for 2020, but the hunger is there. And I think it's not about succumbing, depending on what you want to do with your life. For me, it's not about succumbing to the easier, snackable, simpler stuff, but rather accepting the fact that I'll probably have a smaller audience, but that's okay. And after the book came out, I thought a lot about this. I was like, do you want to be Malcolm Gladwell, or do you want to be an esteemed academic? And they are different. Like, Malcolm Gladwell is extremely successful. I think he's a brilliant storyteller, but his books don't have fact checking. And in the academic field that a lot of this stuff is based in, he's known as someone who doesn't do things well, in the sense of he's misleading. He tells a lot of just so stories. I'm more interested personally, and this is very much a personal thing, in being an academic, and I want to be validated by people thinking I'm clever. And that's a shallow thing to say, but it's the reality. I would rather less people thought I was clever than lots of people thought I was being overly simplistic with my ideas. So I think there's a lot of kind of self reality checking around what it is that you want to do, and patience. But at the end of the day, like, ego plays into it somehow. It's just you got to work out what's going to satisfy which part of your ego. And then of course it is putting it in the right places too. It's not, I want to write big deep places and I'm expecting to get to do that on mainstream central outlets. That's not going to happen, especially if you're not already a big name. You're better going for outlets that really value content more so than your name, at least to begin with, and then build up from there. I really realized that very soon. I was like, I don't want to write the sort of pieces that end up featured in Wired, like on the main features. I've wrote opinion for Wired, but I thought, I really want to get in Wired. That's what I want to do. And when I was pitching pieces and they weren't getting accepted, I was like, it's because I'm not pitching pieces that are right for them at the end of the day. And why is it I really want Wired? Oh, it's because I want the byline because it looks good. It's a lot of that sort of stuff that you have. But then it's like, if you want the Wired byline, then you have to write like Wired, or you have to write those sort of pieces, and having that sort of acceptance. I don't know. I think a lot about my own ego and my own kind of wants with writing. And it doesn't mean I'm not frustrated by when people don't read more stuff. God, it's really annoying when you put a tweet out and nobody likes it, or you put a newsletter out and you don't get as many opens or whatever. But I don't know. I think it's like just trying to remind myself that, to me personally, I care more about being right and the stuff being good than it being read. But that might not be the same for everybody.
I love that framing, and that tension I think is very real. And yeah, maybe in a minute, we'll switch over to Q&A. So anyone who's on the call, you're welcome in a minute or two to just unmute and we'll talk about whatever we want to talk about. And I've got some questions that folks submitted beforehand too. I guess I just wanted to ask maybe one closing question on the theme of hype and on this tension you're talking about. I think this is the paradox. People want to share, many people want to share useful, helpful ideas that maybe are nuanced, maybe do require really engaging with the ideas. But I'm curious, from what you've learned about hype and what you've learned about narratives that sell, has it shaped maybe your own thinking of, can I package up something that I think is credible and useful in a broader narrative that might have a bit more of a visceral appeal? I'm curious to dive in a little bit more.
Oh no, definitely. I can give you the part of the reason I'm doing my PhD right now is because I was faced with this tension and faced with having to think things through. So I finished Mirrors obviously a while ago, and then it came out in April. But the start of this year, I was really, ready to start working on book 2. I was like, I definitely want to do another book. I loved the process. I didn't really enjoy the process of actually having to try and sell it, but writing it, and the writing was hard as well. What I liked was the research. I loved the research and the structuring, and I wanted to go back into that. I loved that feeling. And I was desperate for it. So I had 2 different ideas for 2 different books, worked really hard on one of them. And then the second one kind of got a bit of steam, had an agent, my agent and another agent over in the US were both a bit interested in the specific idea. I had a co-writer and it felt like it was moving forward. And I was like, okay, let's lean into this. And this is book 2. Cool, done. And it was all around science fraud. And so I started writing, started thinking, and it's a topic I know a lot about because I've written about it before, and we've interviewed a lot of people for the podcast about it, and it's things I've spoken at conferences about. So I do have a level of background in it and I could go straight in, but I knew there was a lot of research I wanted to do. There was a lot of stuff I didn't know and stuff that I wanted to know to tell this broader story. So I was really keen on not picking one person who'd committed academic fraud, the whistleblower, and telling their story like a bad blood for academic fraud. I knew that's not what I wanted to do, not because I didn't think I could do it. There's many examples of fraudsters in academia, which is part of the reason why I want to write this damn book. But the fact that there's so many was why I didn't want to write this narrative, because the point is that it's systemic. And so I wanted to write a book that made that point, that there are systemic issues within academia, within whistleblower programs, within all sorts, that incentivize, protect, whatever, academic fraud. And that's a problem. So that's what I wanted to. But of course, the minute you talk about academic fraud, people want the Theranos story of academic fraud, because of course that's an exciting, interesting story, and it's been done so brilliantly by John Carreyrou and the podcast that did it as well, and all sorts. It's known that's a good way of telling the story. So I wrote a chapter that was in the style of Bad Blood, but was like, there's going to be multiple chapters and they're all different stories. So I was trying to like do both at the same time, which my agent was like, this isn't going to work, Gemma, you have to pick what you're doing. And ultimately I realized, no, I want to tell the system story. I really do believe that I can tell the story in a mainstream way. However, I need to think about it for a lot longer to get to that central point. And it was that choice of going, well, do I decide to do it the quote unquote mainstream commercial way that's not necessarily easier, but there's not as much depth in terms of this broader story. It's more about finding people, choosing the story, and then getting to know them well and spending time with them. It's very different. It's not a research-based in the same way kind of storytelling. Or do I want to go away and think about the concept of whistleblowing, and is it a duty to whistleblow, and what does complicity mean, and all these things. And I was like, God, that's going to take me on like a philosophy world. I'm going to have to be thinking about law. I'm going to have to speak to tons of people that like make legislation around this, all sorts. And I knew that I couldn't do that in a short term to sell a book. So that's why I decided to do a PhD on something totally different, by the way, but to give me the kind of ability to work in academia and keep researching this on the side while I research another thing that I'm interested in. So I think I can't remember what the original question was, but that's how I personally work through this. Yeah, that was it. You were saying, could you tell something that's complex? I believe you can tell something complex in a mainstream way. However, I think you need to think about it for a really long time. I don't think it's something you can do quickly. Maybe if you've already been thinking about the stuff in the background of your head for a long time, just I suppose what I had with Smoke and Mirrors, but I only had 8 months to do that. And it wasn't enough. Like when I think back, if I'd had more time, I think I could have made it even more mainstream, or at least made essential ideas slightly more prominent. But I knew that I didn't want to risk that with this story and getting it wrong, if that makes sense. So hopefully that answers your question.
Totally. I love your framing there. And I think I love the nuanced approach to this kind of nuanced question, because you don't want to just make the one anecdotal story your driving narrative when really.
Well, I mean, you could, that would still be an interesting book, and it would still expose, it would still have, but me personally, I was like, first of all, I don't want to write someone's biography because I'm the hero here. I was like, I don't want to find a whistleblower and I want to make whistleblowers the heroes, but I don't want one individual person. Also, a lot of these people don't want that. They don't want that attention. So I knew I would find it hard to find someone that would be okay with an entire book based on them. Do you know what I mean? With the worry about it going big. But really, it was more that it's just what I wanted. It's not necessarily that one is better than the other. And that's what I mean about it. You have to keep coming back to why is it that you want to do this, and what is it you actually want to do? Because you can't make it work if you really don't rush it, I think.
100%. And I've been a terrible timekeeper here. We have 8 minutes on the clock.
I don't mind running over if you need to, by the way. It's totally fine.
Cool. I will, first of all, anyone on the call who maybe has any follow-up questions you want to ask, I invite you can just unmute. We've got enough of a group here. You can just unmute and take the floor. I do have some questions that were submitted beforehand, so I'm happy to use those. But yeah, if there's anyone on the call, you are welcome to take the floor, Alberto.
Sure. Hi. Thanks for this. It was very entertaining. I have one question. It's related to science journalism. So you mentioned that a lot of science journalism is pretty wrong. So I was curious about who do you recommend we read? Who are your favorite science journalists that we can
Ed
start
Young.
following?
Ed Young at The Atlantic is probably, at the moment anyway, he's doing incredible work on coronavirus. I think he's the only writer that I can find that I think is doing it in the way that I wish I could. He's telling these incredible system stories. The Atlantic are giving him space to write 10,000 words a piece. He's writing these big long reads, but he does it in a way that works. People read these things, and a lot of people read his articles, so The Atlantic keep publishing them. But he tells these amazing system stories. He works hard to be really precise, but at the same time doesn't make it a dull read. And he spends a lot of time really thinking about the structure of what he's trying to say. He uses chapters in his long reads, which I suppose you have to when you've got 10,000 words on a publication. But I just think it's quite clever how he crafts his stuff. I think he's brilliant. Who else do I like? I tend to like the writers that, it sounds bad. It's not that I don't like very many science tech writers, but I tend to prefer reading people who are not science and tech writers first and foremost, but write about science and tech. And maybe that's just because I'm a sort of science tech writer already. I'm always looking for stuff that's different. And so I don't really tend to read that much regular science tech journalism. So I think that, oh God, what's her name? Zeynep Tufekci is amazing. She crosses boundaries of researcher, writer, academic, but not in a formal academic sphere. I think her stuff is awesome. I think people like Paris Marx, who obviously is coming from a much more, not obviously, but his surname is Marx. He writes things from a leftist perspective. I associate with those kind of political views. So I really like reading his stuff. Anything that's in The Baffler is brilliant. Anything that's in Logic magazine is brilliant. They're more tech, but really brilliant tech criticism. Oh, and I just finished this amazing book. Oh, it's not next to me. I took it for the other room. It's called What Tech Calls Thinking by Adrian Daub. And he's a professor of comparative literature at Stanford, but he wrote about tech culture in Silicon Valley. And it's sublime the way he writes about culture. So that is those sorts of people that I'm always trying to seek out and see how they do it differently to try and both inform my own writing, but also inform my thinking in different kind of ways.
Yeah, great. Thanks. That's a lot to chew on. So there's a lot of reading to be done there. Thanks.
No worries.
Great question. Yeah, anybody, I've also got the full list here. I'll send it out to everybody. Anyone else on the call want to unmute? We've got 4 minutes on the clock. You're welcome to chime in. Otherwise, I'll use a few of the pre-submitted questions. Awesome. So one of the questions we got beforehand was obviously like you have approached these very deep, nuanced topics and have had this mindset of coming at it from a more kind of academic perspective. And now that we've talked more, I can now see that much more clearly. So this question was around like, how has feedback and editing helped shape the direction of your work? And how do you think about seeking out input from others as you go about crafting a piece?
So when it's an article, I actually don't really have that many people read it. My boyfriend reads it, and he is a very honest person, which is sometimes devastating, but it's good. It's good. It's very helpful. He's very good. He did a PhD in computational biology. He's now a programmer, so he's intelligent and is very good at being like, is that true? Is that sentence correct? He really challenges the sort of statements that I make. And I can be quite bad for that. I can be quite bad for making a statement, not backing it up, not because it's wrong, but just I haven't thought to try and put the evidence in because I'm like, it's obvious, and I'm not making it obvious or not making it clear. So he's really good at catching that. But he's also good at catching my tone because I really like constructing really complicated sentences, which is not helpful at all if you actually want people to read your work. My sentences are always super long. There's always like a bracket and then a hyphen and then a colon and then something else that I can find to put another subclause within all these other subclauses, and then it zooms out. And that's how I speak. I write as I speak, and I try and tell a story that eventually comes back to my point. Sometimes get a bit lost. There's always subclauses when you're saying. So he tends to catch that and be like, there's 8 subclauses in the sentence. What are you talking about? Delete that. So he was really helpful with that sort of stuff. And then of course there's formal editors when I'm submitting. But with my book, I had expert readers to do essentially fact checking and making sure what I was saying made sense because I was talking about their industry. So they didn't really need to find it like a fascinating read. I just wanted them to know if it felt true and correct, if I was getting anything wrong. I then had beta readers who were people that I saw as members of the audience that I was trying to get to. I got a lot of people from the subscribers of my newsletter, by the way. I just put out and said, hey, do any of you want to read? And I figured if they liked my writing in the newsletter, they were probably interested in the sort of things that be in my book. So I got all of my beta readers from there, which is people volunteer to read one chapter here, one chapter there, whatever, and give their feedback. I did like a writing retreat. The woman who run it was also an editor. So I got her to paid for that before I submitted. If you're a debut and you don't have a really big deal with a publisher, I'd recommend that, because I thought the publisher was going to tear my book apart, do tons of editing, and they didn't. They essentially did like a line edit, and I was actually really disappointed because I wanted better editing. But luckily I had got this external editor and she really tore it apart over the course of a week. And her thing was like really going, what is your point? What are you trying to say? What is essential thing, over and over again, until I finally got to it. Yeah, it's all kind of different kinds of editing. But with articles, I edit as I go. I really like it to be more or less final. I don't like to rewrite. I don't like spending tons of time trying to think over my head for ages and then more or less in a winner. And then let Lawrence pull it to threads. Pull it apart.
I love it. It's great to have a significant other who's willing to give you the I don't believe you test, which is...
I am very lucky.
Sometimes
I'm like, can you read this? And he's, we've already spoken this article so many times. I'm like, I know, but now I've written it. Can you just check it, please?
I will actually listen to you. Do your worst.
Yeah.
I will be our timekeeper here. I will keep us to the hour. And Gemma, I do want to end and say, where should people find you? Where's the best place to follow you online?
Probably Twitter, just at Gemma Milne, my name. I have a newsletter, which I will be eventually the last thing went out months ago and it's been a bit on hiatus, but it'll be starting up again soon. It's called Brain Reel. It's on Substack. I think you can find it on my website somewhere. Yeah, it'll be on my website, on the main page of my website, which is just gemmamilne.co.uk. Yeah, that's probably Instagram if you're that kind of person. Gemma Milne Writer. Mainly Twitter though.
Fantastic. I know Twitter's where all the writers hang out. So I think that's the place to be.
It's also where you link to everything else. So if you go there, you'll find everything else. Do you know what I mean?
Totally. It's the central link hub. Gemma, I just have mountains of notes here. I'm so excited to share this recording with the rest of the group. We'll send it out to everybody who's on the call in the next day or two. And just can't thank you enough for all the hard-won wisdom.
This was really fun. Thank you, Stu. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining. And Gemma, thanks again. Hope to do a round two.
Cheers, guys. Bye.
Awesome. See y'all.